It gives me great pleasure to offer a lecture that's part of the school's Jessen series, as well as a prologue lecture to the Secret Life of Building Symposium. The school, the center helped put this together, and so did the school lecture series. And perhaps unusually, we have a lecturer today who is not an architect, but who has a great deal to say about things that we care a lot about at our school. As you know, we are searching for a new dean for our school, and that's set the faculty and the students to thinking about what kind of school we are. What is it that makes University of Texas at Austin a school that's different to others? That has not been easy. We've come up with slogans that I will not mention to the relief of my fellow faculty. But there's definitely a sense that our school is a school that is still very much interested in how things are made and in the beauty that can come out of making, whether we call it construction or fabrication or craft or design or materiality and so forth. That this is a tradition at our school that I do believe will continue. And I think everyone who's in this room who came to see Mathew Crawford is someone who's interested in seeing what that orientation might mean into a future that's becoming ever more digital, ephemeralized, and harder to sort of sense and feel and relate to people with. That was very inarticulate. Mathew will not be. He is the author of Shop Class as Soulcraft, a beautiful title, an inquiry into the value of work, and most recently, The World Beyond Your Head, on becoming an individual in an age of distraction. Both books were enormously well received, bestsellers, in fact, and very much bestsellers for the genre of book they are, which is cultural critique and philosophy applied to things that philosophy is not normally applied to. If you look at his background, you can sort of see why. He attended the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he majored in physics. He earned a Ph.D. in political philosophy from Chicago, specializing in ancient political thought. He is now a senior fellow at the University of Virginia Institute for Advanced Studies of Culture, and he also makes parts for custom motorcycles. He's an avid motorcyclist. In fact, on the walk over here, we just started talking about motorcycles. I thought I might just say a few words in praise of his books that you can find. Crawford packs plenty of firepower into his polemic, quoting Aristotle in his own translation and sprinkling the text with erudite footnotes. Crawford, like Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. His book reveals both why we do what we do and the way we do it, why we do it is important. Just 3 days after publication, Shop Class reached number 23 in the New York Times bestseller list. The following 3 weeks went through 5 printings. Mathew has obviously touched a nerve in our culture, and I'm so pleased and proud to have him come and speak to us today. Mathew Crawford, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for having me here at The Secret Life of Buildings, which has to be the best title of any conference I've ever been to. I'm not really going to be talking about buildings, but I will be talking about public spaces. And so my big theme is attention as a cultural problem. So let me just start with some impressions of daily life. I think it was about 10 years ago. I was in a supermarket and I swiped my bank card to pay for my groceries. And you know, there's the little screen that you look at because it prompts you to do each step. You enter your PIN, and confirm the amount. Well, during the intervals, I was shown advertisements on the little screen because some genius had figured out that a person in that situation is a captive audience. And the intervals themselves, I had previously assumed they were just some artifact of the communication technology, but now they seem to be something more deliberately calibrated. These haltings clearly served somebody's interest. And that's when it hit me that a new stage of capitalism has been opened up by our self-appointed disruptors. And it's one where you win competitive advantage by being the most ruthless or shameless in trying to dig up and monetize every bit of private headspace. So if you ride the bus in Seoul, South Korea, there's a smell resembling that of Dunkin' Donuts coffee that's released into the ventilation system of the bus whenever the Dunkin' Donuts jingle plays over the sound system. And this happens just as the bus pulls up outside a Dunkin' Donuts shop. And in case you somehow missed it, the driver points out the fact. There remain many areas for further progress. So the homework, report cards, permission slips, all those little communications that a teacher sends home with students are in many school districts still blank on the back. So here's a gross offense against the efficient use of space. But there's at least one school in Massachusetts that now sells advertising space on the backs of these little slips of paper. I learned that from the Colbert Report. And I think you almost have to be a comedian to wrap your head around contemporary culture these days. I'm making my way through O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and I'm not feeling especially receptive to the message that's applied to the moving handrail on the escalator in an endlessly recurring loop. It's literally plastered on the handrail. It says, "You're in charge." I don't feel very, it's the Lincoln Financial Group, I think is what it was. I don't feel very in charge. It seems like every surface of public space is getting auctioned off to private interests. And I think that's connected to our wider sense that politics has been captured by such interests. The very idea of a public has been eroded. I get to my gate with an hour to kill, and I find that I'm unable to escape the chattering of CNN. If the TV is within view, I find it very hard not to look at it. The introduction of novelty into your field of view commands what the cognitive psychologists call an orienting response. And of course, this is an important evolutionary adaptation in a world of predators, because it could be a python or something. So the animal turns its face and eyes to the new thing. Well, a new thing appears about every second on TV. The images on the screen jump out of the flow of experience and make a demand on us. In their presence, it's hard to rehearse a remembered conversation, for example. Now, in that situation, people may stare at their phones or open a novel, hoping to tune out the piped-in chatter. In this battle of attentional technologies, what's lost is the kind of public space that's required for a certain kind of sociability. A public space where people are not self-enclosed in the heightened way that happens when our minds are elsewhere than our bodies may feel rich with possibility for spontaneous encounters. Even if we don't converse with others, our mutual reticence is experienced as reticence if our attention is not otherwise bound up, but is rather free to alight upon one another and linger, or not, because we ourselves are free to pay out our attention in deliberate measures. To be the object of someone's reticence is quite different from not being seen by them. We may have a vivid experience of having encountered another person, even if in silence. Such encounters are always ambiguous, and their need for interpretation gives rise to a train of imaginings, often erotic. I think that's what makes cities exciting. Now, of course, when you're trapped at the airport like that, you can simply shift in your seat and avert your gaze from the screens. But the fields of view that haven't been claimed for commerce seem to be getting narrower and fewer. The ever more complete penetration of public spaces by attention-getting technologies exploits the orienting response in a way that preempts sociability, directing us away from one another and toward a manufactured reality, the content of which is determined from afar by private parties that have a material interest in doing so. In the main currents of psychological research, attention is treated as a resource. A person has only so much of it. But we don't yet have a political economy corresponding to this resource. And so toward that end, let me just offer a beginning point, which is the concept of an attentional commons. There are some resources that we hold in common, such as the air we breathe and the water we drink. We take them for granted, but their widespread availability makes everything else we do possible. I think the absence of noise is a resource of just this sort. More precisely, the valuable thing that we take for granted is the condition of not being addressed. Just as clean air makes it possible to breathe, silence, in this broader sense, is what makes it possible to think. Now, we give it up willingly when we're in the company of other people that we know, and when we open ourselves to serendipitous encounters with strangers. To be addressed by mechanized means is an entirely different matter. The benefits of silence are off the books. They're not measured directly by gross domestic product, but surely contribute to creativity and innovation and things that economists do care about. They don't show up explicitly in social statistics, such as level of educational achievement. Yet one consumes, if that's the right word, a great deal of silence in the course of becoming educated. Silence is now offered as a luxury good. So I once had the pleasure of being in the business class lounge at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. And so what you hear is the occasional tinkling of a spoon against china. That's it. I didn't see any ads on the walls. If I remember right, there weren't any TVs. And this silence is what makes it feel genuinely luxurious. So you step inside and there's these sort of airtight doors that whoosh shut behind you. And the difference is nearly tactile. It's like stepping out of hair cloth into satin. Your brow unfurrows itself, your neck muscles start to relax. And after 20 minutes, you no longer feel exhausted. The hassle lifts. Now, outside the lounge is the usual airport cacophony. Because we've allowed our attention to be monetized, if you want yours back, you're going to have to pay for it. As the commons gets appropriated, one solution for those who have the means is to leave the commons for private clubs such as the business class lounge. Now, when you consider that it's those in the business lounge who make the decisions that determine the character of the peon lounge, and you may start to see these things in a political light. To engage in playful, inventive thinking, and possibly create wealth for yourself during those idle hours spent at an airport requires silence. But other people's minds, over in the peon lounge or the bus, can be treated as a resource, a standing reserve of purchasing power, to be steered according to the brilliant marketing ideas hatched by those enjoying silence in the business lounge. When some people treat the minds of other people as a resource, this is not creating wealth, as the phrase has it. It's a transfer of wealth. The ever greater concentration of wealth in a shrinking elite is surely due to a complex array of causes, but let's just throw one more into the mix for consideration. And that is the ever more aggressive appropriations of the attentional commons that we've allowed to take place. But intrusive advertising is just the tip of a much larger cultural iceberg. We're living through a crisis of attention, a widespread sense of mental fragmentation. We often feel that our attention isn't simply ours to direct as we will. This can feel like a crisis of self-ownership. At its worst, it may cause you to wonder if you can maintain a coherent self. I mean a self that's able to act according to settled purposes and ongoing projects, rather than flitting about. We generally attribute this problem to technology, but I think it has deeper cultural roots. Our distractibility seems to indicate that we're agnostic on the question of what is worth paying attention to, that is, what to value. To answer this question freely requires shelter, a space for seriousness that has to be carved out resolutely against the noise. The existentialist writer Simone Weil and the psychologist William James both suggested that the struggle to pay attention trains the faculty of attention. It's a habit built up through practice. Grappling with a problem that you don't have much aptitude or inclination for, say a geometry problem, exercises our power to attend. For Weil, this ascetic aspect of attention, the fact that it is a negative effort against mental sloth, is especially significant. She writes, "Something in our soul has a far more violent repugnance for true attention than the flesh has for bodily fatigue. This something is much more closely connected with evil than is the flesh. That's why every time that we really concentrate our attention, we destroy the evil in ourselves. Students must therefore work without any reference to their natural abilities and tastes, applying themselves equally to all their tasks, with the idea that each one will help to form in them the habit of attention, which is the substance of prayer." Now, I think it should be duly noted that Weil was a mystic who, some people say, deliberately starved herself to death. And indeed, her dismissal of natural inclinations in the young suggests she was more infatuated with self-mortification than she was seriously concerned with how students might best learn. Yet Weil's existential melodrama shouldn't prevent us from appreciating her point that the ascetic disposition has an important role in education. To attend to anything in a sustained way requires actively excluding all the other things that grab at our attention. It requires, if not ruthlessness toward oneself, a capacity for self-regulation. And reciprocally, the ability to control oneself in the face of some temptation is greatly enhanced by, indeed seems simply to be, the ability to direct one's attention toward something else. There's a classic psych experiment you might have heard about where children are given the option of having one marshmallow immediately, or if they're able to wait 15 minutes, 2 marshmallows. So left alone with the marshmallow at hand, some of them break down and gobble it up immediately. Others, after a brief struggle, but about a third of the children succeed in deferring gratification and getting the bigger payoff. Those who did so were those who distracted themselves from the marshmallow by playing games under the table, singing songs, or imagining the marshmallow as a cloud, for example. And in a follow-up study of the same kids a dozen years later, Their initial performance on the self-regulation task was more predictive of life success than any other measure, including IQ and socioeconomic status. So the interpretation of this is that it isn't willpower, as conventionally understood, that distinguishes the successful children. Rather, it's the ability to strategically allocate their attention so that their actions aren't determined by the wrong thoughts. Self-regulation, like attention, is a resource of which we have a finite amount. And further, the two resources are intimately related. So if someone is tasked with controlling their impulses for some extended period of time, their performance on a task requiring attention is degraded if you do that task, sort of shortly following. Without the ability to direct, this is sort of the cultural significance of this, I think. Without the ability to direct our attention where we will, we become more receptive to those who would direct our attention where they will, to the omnipresent purveyors of marshmallows. To the extent that the power of concentration is widely attenuated, so too is the power of self-regulation. We become more easily suggestible and buy more stuff. I suppose this is good for economic growth. But if consumer capitalism can go on only by continuing to accelerate the intensification of nervous stimulation, that's actually a phrase from 100 years ago, then there would seem to be a fundamental antagonism between this form of economic life and the individual who inhabits it. That is, we may have a problem. The media have become masters at packaging stimuli in ways that our brains find irresistible, just as food engineers have become expert in creating what they call hyper-palatable foods, things like Cheetos, by getting the levels of sugar and fat and salt just right. Distractibility might be regarded as the mental equivalent of obesity. The palatability of certain kinds of mental stimulation seems to be hardwired, just like our taste for sugar, fat, and salt. Inhabiting a highly engineered environment, the natural world begins to seem bland and tasteless, like broccoli compared to Cheetos. Stimulation begets a need for more stimulation. Without it, one feels antsy, unsettled, hungry almost. When I was in grad school in Chicago, this is in the sort of early to 90s up to about 2000. So I used to go to the library and often sit there for 10 or even 12 hours at a stretch. I'd get up for food and whatnot. But this is a time when the internet was just kind of coming on the scene. I think my TV at home got 4 channels. And so email was something that you had to go to a special room to check your email in the library. It was the room with networked computers, which was kind of a big deal. So it was the same place where they had the printers. So I'd go, while I'm printing out a draft of some paper, I would go and check my email, and sometimes I would have one, which was really exciting. Whereas now I open a book of Aristotle and I try to read a page of his very kind of choppy Greek. And after a few lines, I start to shift my weight in the chair. I'm drumming my fingers on the table. And then, after half a page or so, I realize it is Tuesday night, and Sons of Anarchy is on. So I turn that on and share the experience with 4.6 million of my closest friends. And the next day, I have some basis for chit-chat with others. I'm not a freak. If I had gotten absorbed in Aristotle's ethics, my head would still be turning in a spiral of untimely meditations that could only sound strange to other people. So in grad school, I really did feel quite disconnected from the surrounding culture. Because I was just kind of going down this rabbit hole of my studies. Whereas now, I like to think that I'm pretty hip. And don't get me wrong, TV these days is awesome, and I don't mean to blame it for my current shallowness. But if my experience is typical, it means we're becoming more similar to one another. I think there's a large cultural consequence to our ability to concentrate on things that aren't immediately engaging, or our lack of such ability. And that is the persistence of intellectual diversity, or not. To insist on the importance of trained powers of concentration is to recognize that independence of thought and feeling is a fragile thing, and it requires certain conditions. What sort of ecology can preserve a robust intellectual biodiversity? We often assume that diversity is a natural upshot of free choice. Yet the market ideal of choice and attendant preoccupation with freedom tends toward a monoculture of human types, the late modern consumer self. At least the market seems to have this effect when we're constantly being addressed with hyper-palatable stimuli. Because what sort of outlier would you have to be? What sort of freak of self-control to resist those well-engineered cultural marshmallows? According to the prevailing notion of freedom, it manifests as preference satisfaction. Preferences themselves are beyond rational scrutiny. They express the authentic core of a self whose freedom is realized when there are no obstacles to its preference-satisfying behavior. Reason is in the service of this freedom in a purely instrumental way. It's a person's capacity to calculate the best means to satisfy his ends. About the ends themselves, we're to maintain a principled silence out of respect for the autonomy of the individual. To do otherwise would be to risk lapsing into paternalism. Thus does liberal agnosticism about the human good line up with the market ideal of choice. We invoke the latter, choice, as a content-free meta-good that bathes every actual choice made in the softly egalitarian, flattering light of autonomy. This mutually reinforcing set of posits about freedom and rationality provides the basic framework for the discipline of economics and for what's called liberal theory in departments of political science. It's all wonderfully consistent, even beautiful. But the language of preference satisfaction and attendant preoccupation with freedom seems ill-suited to our current circumstances, if what we want is to preserve human possibilities from going extinct. If you were to regularly airdrop Cheetos over the entire territory of a game preserve, you'd probably find that all the herbivores preferred them right away, to whatever pathetic grubs and roots they had been eating. And a few years later, the lions, they would have decided that hunting is not only barbaric, but worse, it's inconvenient. The cheetahs would come around eventually, all that running, and the savannah would be ruled by three-toed sloths with orange fur. One thing that distinguishes human beings from other animals is that we are evaluative creatures. We can take a critical stance toward our own activities and aspire to direct ourselves toward objects and projects that we judge to be more worthy than others that may be more immediately gratifying. Animals are guided by appetites that are fixed, and so are we. But we can also form a second-order desire, a desire for a desire, when we entertain some picture of the sort of person we would like to be. A person who's better not because she has more self-control, but because she's moved by worthier desires. Acquiring the tastes of a serious person is what we call education. So the question is, does it have a future? The advent of engineered, hyper-palatable mental stimuli compels us to ask the question. The transformation currently underway in our attentional environment point up, I think, the limitations of the idea of individual self-determination and of exhortations to exert more self-control. We're in it together, and that makes it political. And at the risk of seeming to just be a complainer, let me share with you one further impression by way of trying to sketch the difficulty. So a few years ago, I visited Las Vegas, which is a place designed really for the single purpose of separating you from your money. The female form there is used very freely in advertisements. These bombard you from the moment you step off your plane, very aggressively. And they work, I think, just as surely as tying a rope to a person's neck and giving it a sharp yank. The point, of course, is to pull you into some casino or other money pit. Now, once the initial excitement wears off, you start to feel like a rat in a city-sized experiment in social engineering. Nothing subtle, no feeling that isn't industrial strength in its urgency and standardized in its appeal can arise in such a ruthlessly monetized attentional environment. And of course, here the nudgers are not government bureaucrats, but those who would monetize our attention. And by the way, the ownership of casinos in Vegas passed from the mob to Wall Street investors in the 1990s. Now, of course, Vegas is an extreme case. But more generally, it's been said that advanced economies are moving away from producing goods or even providing services in favor of creating experiences, whether it's porn, psychoactive drugs, or a well-curated ecotourism adventure. And this is sometimes called affective tourism, affective capitalism. And you can think of these as quasi-autistic forms of escape from the frustrations of the world beyond your head. And Vegas as a laboratory where the cutting edge of these arts is being honed. Human experience is becoming a highly engineered and therefore manipulable thing. So now for something a little more positive. The alternative, I think, is to reclaim the real as against manufactured experiences. This happens when we immerse ourselves in skilled practices that make real demands on us and bring us into face-to-face contact with others. Cooking an elaborate meal for an important occasion would be one example. Such practices locate the possible answers to the question, what is to be done next, outside our own heads, in our relations to objects and to other people. They establish narrow and highly structured patterns of attention, what I call ecologies of attention, that can give coherence to our mental lives, however briefly. In such an ecology, the perception of a skilled practitioner is tuned to the features of the environment that are pertinent to effective action. Extraneous information is dampened, and irrelevant courses of action disappear. Our energies are no longer dissipated in a proliferation of choices. This relieves us of the burden of self-regulation. And that's good because self-regulation is like a muscle and one that's easily exhausted. You can't do it all day, every day. Especially when faced with all kinds of marshmallows. So earlier I said that training one's attention requires an ascetic disposition. But more fundamentally, attention is erotic, in the sense that we're drawn out of ourselves towards something of intrinsic interest, something beautiful. when we're engaged with it directly. Cooking, playing sports, playing music together, building things, fixing things. Activities like these establish ecologies of attention that can help us overcome the mental fragmentation of contemporary culture. So in the book that Mike mentioned, I present case studies of this. So I've got short order cooks, hockey players, and people who build musical instruments. Now, if you think I've gotten something right in my somewhat cranky description of our cultural moment, it means we have to revisit the question of liberal education. The medieval distinction was between the liberal arts and the servile arts. The former are those befitting a free person. The latter are those that someone who's less than free is condemned to practice. They were also called the mechanical arts. And this made perfect sense. You learned the mechanical arts out of necessity to win your bread. The liberal arts require leisure, hence wealth, which was an accident of birth. But we can also think of the liberal arts, I think without stretching the term too badly, we can think of the liberal arts as those by which you secure your freedom. What they consist of will then depend on where the threats to freedom lie. If I'm right about the role of skilled practices, and indeed the mechanical arts, in gathering our mental energies, it means that they have a special role to play, a liberal role, in a culture of distraction. So we may need to reconsider the categories of liberal arts and servile arts, and with them, the distinction between liberal education and vocational education. Now, some people get hustled off to college and then to the cubicle against their own inclinations and natural bents, when they might rather be learning to build things or fix things. There's a woodshop teacher named Doug Stowe who's written really nicely about his work as a shop teacher. And he wrote that in schools, we create artificial learning environments for our children that they know to be contrived and undeserving of their full attention and engagement. Without the opportunity to learn through the hands, the world remains abstract and distant, and the passions for learning will not be engaged. I don't think that's true of every student, but it's true of enough students that we ought to worry about it. A gifted young person who chooses, let's say, to become a mechanic rather than accumulate academic credentials is viewed as eccentric, maybe even self-destructive. There's a pervasive anxiety among parents that there's only one track to success for their children, and it runs through a series of gates controlled by prestigious institutions. And of course, there's wide use of psychiatric drugs to medicate boys in particular against their natural bent toward action, the better to keep things on track, as the school nurse says. I'm thinking of Nurse Ratched from, okay, it's just so you have the image. And of course, this serves the interests of educators in preserving their own sanity. And I know that because I taught high school for a year, and I would have loved to have had a Ritalin fogger in my classroom, just for the sake of maintaining order. So I think I understand the problem, but what the problem is that it's a rare person, male or female, who's naturally inclined to sit still for 16 years in school and then indefinitely at work. And yet this has become the one-size-fits-all norm, even as we go on about diversity in education. I don't think we do a very good job of accommodating diversity of dispositions and how people best learn. So it doesn't have to be that way. Things are quite different, in fact, in some European countries. Germany really stands out. That's a place where it's over half, in fact, I think it's closer to 2/3 of 16-year-olds enter an apprenticeship program. And they just have a very different culture of work and education there. So there, a smart and ambitious 16-year-old might imagine him or herself becoming, say, a prototype machinist at Mercedes-Benz. And that's a very respectable aspiration to have. In this country, apprenticeship is often criticized for being too narrow in education. It's often said that what the economy demands is workers who are flexible, almost that they shouldn't be burdened with any particular set of skill or knowledge, so they can be maximally disruptible or something. But I think it bears thinking about that when you go deep into some particular skill or art, it trains your powers of concentration and perception. You become more discerning about these particular objects, whatever they are. And if all goes well, I think you begin to care viscerally about quality because you've been initiated into an ethic of caring about what you're doing. And usually that's by the example of some particular person, some mentor who embodies that spirit of craftsmanship. So what I'm trying to say is that technical training, though it's certainly narrow in its immediate application, can be viewed as part of education in the broadest sense, and that is intellectual and moral formation. Maybe that was a sign I should stop. How are we doing on time? Because I could. Yeah. All right. I'm going to risk the anger of the gods and keep going here. So, in this bookshop class at Soulcraft, I wrote about the de-skilling of everyday life. The core theme was individual agency. That is the experience of seeing a direct effect of your actions in the world, and knowing that these actions are genuinely your own. And I suggested that genuine agency arises not in the context of mere choices freely made, as in shopping, but rather somewhat paradoxically in the context of submission to things that have their own intractable ways, whether it be a musical instrument, a garden, or the building of a bridge. Things can serve as a kind of authority for us by way of structuring our attention. The design of things, for example, cars and children's toys, conditions the kind of involvement we have in our own activity. Design establishes an ecology of attention that can be more or less well adapted to the requirements of skillful action. There's a prominent design philosophy that severs the bonds between action and perception, as in contemporary cars that insulate us from the road. That is, they insulate us from the sensory motor contingencies by which an embodied being normally grasps reality. The world appears to us as through a screen. Representations collapse the basic axis of proximity and distance by which an embodied being normally orients in the world and draws a horizon of relevance around itself. When our contact with the world is mediated by layers of representation, there's a kind of arbitrariness or lack of necessity that I think exacerbates our mental fragmentation. And by the way, I think distracted driving is partly this. In other words, because the driving of the car itself has become so uninvolving, all the gadgetry that we distract ourselves with, there's nothing to compete with it. The terms submission and authority are jarring to the modern ear. They may be especially unexpected here, because haven't I been making a case for reclaiming our mental autonomy? But in fact, I think the experience of attending to something isn't easily made sense of within the prevailing Western anthropology that takes autonomy as the central human good. Understood literally, autonomy means giving a law to oneself. The opposite of autonomy thus understood is heteronomy, to use Kant's term. That is, being ruled by something alien to yourself. In a culture predicated on this opposition, autonomy good, heteronomy bad, it's difficult to think clearly about attention, the faculty that joins us to the world, because everything located beyond your head is regarded as a potential source of heteronomy, and therefore a threat to the self. Now, I realize that sounds like an overstatement, but it's implicit in the view of the human person that we've received from certain Enlightenment figures who are working out a new and quite radical notion of freedom. So in this short talk, actually it's not that short, I'm merely going to assert that the ideal of autonomy works against the development and flourishing of any rich ecology of attention, the sort in which minds may become powerful and achieve genuine independence. As against notions of self-sufficiency, there are important ways in which our environment constitutes the self rather than compromises it. Attention is at the core of this constitutive or formative process. When we become competent in some particular field of practice, our perception is disciplined by that practice. We become attuned to pertinent features of a situation that would be invisible to a bystander. Through the exercise of a skill, the self that acts in the world takes on a definite shape. It comes to be in a relation of fit to a world it has grasped. To emphasize this is to put oneself at odds with some pervasive cultural reflexes. Any quick perusal of the self-help section of a bookstore teaches that the central character in our contemporary drama is a being who must choose what he is to be and bring about his transformation through an effort of the will. It's a heroic project of open-ended, ultimately groundless self-making. If the attentive self is in a relation of fit to a world it has apprehended, the autonomous self is in a relation of creative mastery to a world it has projected. The latter self-understanding is an invitation to narcissism, to be sure, but it also makes us more easily manipulated. As atomized individuals called to create meaning for ourselves, we find ourselves the recipients of all manner of solicitude and guidance. We're offered forms of unfreedom that come slyly wrapped in autonomy talk. No limits, as the credit card offer says. You're in charge. Autonomy talk speaks the language of preference satisfaction. Discovering your true preferences requires maximizing the number of choices you face, which is precisely the condition that makes for maximum dissipation of one's energies. Autonomy talk is a flattering mode of speech. It suggests that freedom is something we're entitled to, and it consists in liberation from constraints imposed by one's circumstances. The image of human excellence I'd like to offer as a counterweight to freedom thus understood is that of a powerful, independent mind working at full song. Such independence is won through disciplined attention and the kind of action that joins us to the world. And it's precisely those constraining circumstances that provide the discipline. This claim about the role of attention in bringing the self into a relation of fit to the external world is part of a broader anthropological assertion I make in the book, and that is that we find ourselves situated in a world that is not of our making. And this situatedness is fundamental to what a human being is. So I think we need to reinterpret what are often taken to be encumbrances to the personal will in the modern tradition, that is, sources of unfreedom, and identify them rather as the framing conditions for many of the most worthwhile human performances. These include material reality, other people, and the inheritance of the past. I don't really have a conclusion to offer you from this, but just by way of stopping, I'll say that for several hundred years now, the ideal self of the West has been striving to secure its freedom by rendering the external world fully pliable to its will. For the originators of modern thought, this was to be accomplished by treating objects as projections of the mind. We make contact with them only through our representations of them, right? There's no access to the thing in itself. Early in the 21st century, our daily lives are saturated with representations. We've come to resemble the human person as posited in Enlightenment thought, even though I think that whole picture is mistaken. Such is the power and ubiquity of these representations that we find ourselves living a highly mediated existence. The thing is, in this style of existence, it's we ourselves who've been rendered pliable to whoever has the power to craft the most bewitching representations or control the portals of public space through which we have to pass just to conduct the business of life. Now, autonomy talk stems from Enlightenment epistemology and moral theory, which did important polemical work in their day against various forms of coercion. But times have changed. The philosophical project we need to take up now is that of reclaiming the real as against representations. In such a project, the central term of approbation would not be freedom, but agency. For it's when we're engaged in a skilled practice that the world shows up for us as having a reality of its own, independent of the self. And reciprocally, the self comes into view as being in a situation that is not of its own making. It's in the encounter between the self and the brute, alien otherness of the real that beautiful things become possible. For example, the puck-handling finesse of the hockey player. Encountering the world as real can be a source of pleasure, indeed of quasi-religious feelings of wonder and gratitude, in light of which manufactured realities are revealed as pale counterfeits and may lose some of their grip on us. We might find ourselves free to think once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wonder if you'd be open to some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Some questions, please.
Yeah, you spoke of Las Vegas Las Vegas as a kind of social science experiment.
Mm-hmm.
But given how effective it is, it looks more like a fully functioning social science of manipulation, right? It's not actually an experiment. They know what they're doing.
Right.
So with regard to this sort of hyper stage of capitalism you described, are these people making decisions for the rest of us in the Charles de Gaulle business airport? Do they know that they're enslaving us? Or is it more a sort of function of the incentives of the marketplace? I mean, are they consciously saying we're going to suck their souls out? Or is it just kind of just that's the way business is done? And then maybe as a follow-up, if they don't know what they're doing, is it even more of an insidious problem than if they do know what they're doing?
Yeah. Well, I think, there's obviously a great variety of how reflective people are about what they're doing. But on the sort of darker end of the spectrum of self-awareness about what's going on, it's apparently true that the business model of machine gambling, which is a very particular thing. We're not talking about people playing blackjack or, craps. It's when you sit in front of the machine pulling the lever, it opens up all kinds of possibilities. There's a fantastic book by the title Addiction by Design. It's all about the very sophisticated practices, sort of cognitively well-informed practices by which machine gambling creates addiction by design. Anyhow, that not just business model, but even sort of design scripts have been migrating from Vegas to those who design mobile gaming apps, and even the personnel moving from one to the other. So the point is to maximize time on device. So there is, at least in some quarters of the economy, people who are very self-conscious about what they're doing. But I take your point that there's a kind of larger systemic kind of net of, just one finds oneself in these, maybe working at whatever, Pokemon Go or something, I don't know what. But there was some, so yeah, even more kind of troubling in that sense if it's not, I guess I like to think that these things are amenable to being changed by being criticized, because ultimately there are human agents who are doing these things. But the kind of, I think they're often able to invoke a kind of rhetoric of freedom and choice and all that stuff I talked about that tends to short circuit our critical faculties. Freedom, good, yeah. So there's that.
Would anyone else? Go ahead.
Yeah.
How do you propose, do you think it's possible to build consensus around a new morality, a new idea of what's moral or what's good? If so, how do you do this?
Write great books.
I guess if I knew I could set up shop as a philosopher king or something. I don't know. I don't really know how history works, with a capital H. There's certainly, I think one thing that distinguishes our moment is that there are people who definitely feel they have the winds of history at their back. There's a kind of Jacobin spirit of progressivism that kind of scares the crap out of me, frankly. And universities are ground zero of that. So that's one reason I'm not a professor. But I don't have a more serious answer to you. Sorry.
Perhaps one more question. Go ahead.
I really enjoyed the talk, and thank you very much for taking us on this, really philosophical exploration of this question of attention. And I was just wondering, how do you square off the fact that, for many of those people that you're talking about, as, craft-oriented or, sort of they get in the zone doing something, right? They are, in fact, some of them creating the very worlds that you're depicting as manipulative and disruptive of the attention of others.
Sure.
So, in other words, how do you square that off, right? I mean, so you're on the one hand advocating for people doing work that gets them in the zone. Some people design games, and that gets them in the zone, and they have a very successful life doing that and fulfilling life. Are you ultimately talking about the way the economic system is, sort of works, and the kinds of job? I mean, I'm just trying to understand the relationship, because it could be that everyone is having a good time creating stuff, right?
Right. Some very small number of people having a nice life creating games, and others who may quite enjoy playing them, some percentage of them find themselves kind of addicted and in an unhealthy way. Same with porn, right? I mean, to be a maker of porn sounds like it could be a good time, but the the sort of compulsive, like rat hitting the little dose of cocaine aspect of it is not as attractive. But at your point, you raise a much more fundamental issue. Right, so am I merely saying that to be absorbed in some practice is a good thing, sort of irrespective of the end toward which that practice is directed? So that, I think if you were, say, a gunsmith, and you're fashioning just a really satiny, smooth trigger pull, for a mob hitman, I can see that you could really get into this, and it would be, in some ways, it would answer to all the sort of goods that I've talked about here. But we would criticize him for sort of failing to step outside his sort of little craft world and reflect on the ends toward which it's being put. And I like the example of a gun because I think a gun is sort of a radically pliable thing. It can be put toward, self-defense or murder. It's sort of, the meaning of it is very pliable in that way. So it really crystallizes your point. There are other practices. The one that I spend the most time on in the new book, The World Beyond Your Head, is these organ makers. And they make pipe organs, Baroque pipe organs. And it's an especially nice case because so they have their own little guild, where they have their internal kind of standards and practices that they're very obsessive about. But they're making these instruments. In fact, there's one behind the screen I saw for a market. They're making them for churches and concert halls. And so they have to answer to the customer, first of all. So they have to at least be able to step outside their sort of obsessive guild mentality to build to a contract price and all that. But more significantly, the organ is in the service of music. It's in fact, it's in the service of particular kinds of liturgical music that are particular to some denomination. Because the organ is very much part of the building, it's in conversation with sort of architectural trends of different denominations at different points in history. So my point is that the organ is much more kind of rigidly located than a gun. It's in these nestled set of practices, and the organ making activity is always sort of pointing beyond itself toward these ends that it serves, and that you could follow it all the way up to kind of theological questions. Or some, like the Eastern Orthodox reject the organ altogether, and it's for very serious theological reasons. So I think that's the example that would be most successful in resisting your very acute point that you make. So yeah, it's merely to be absorbed in something, to hold that up as a model of ethical life would be completely inadequate, because this is the whole problem with technology, is that its practitioners have to answer to some notion of the good that is external to their practice. And in fact, this gets back, I think, to the Silicon Valley / machine gambling Vegas image, is that if we fail to, as a society, hold them toward some publicly affirmable notion of what's good, they're gonna do what they do. So yeah, it's not an abstract problem. It's a very real social and political problem.
We'll have one more question from Graham Harmon.
This is a wonderful lecture, and I felt deeply sympathetic to the things you were saying. The question I have for you is, since the model of progress and of modernity is so closely connected with this idea of separating ourselves from the world and being alienated from the world and transforming it as something apart from it, What argument would you use against someone who accuses you of being an anti-enlightenment thinker or an anti-progress thinker?
Shrug. I think those are two different things. In some sense, yeah, progress is the whole kind of idea of the Enlightenment. But so again, for me, the attractiveness of the organ-making one is that it explores in that chapter the progressive possibilities of tradition. And at the heart of early modern thought is liberation from tradition, the idea that you have to stand on your own 2 feet epistemically and sort of think everything through from scratch. I mean, there's Descartes sitting on his stove or whatever it is. So the kind of the picture of the human being and the picture of how we come to know the world that I've been most impressed with as kind of ringing true comes from phenomenology from 100 years ago, when there was a real rethinking of some of the basic posits of Enlightenment thought. And I haven't in this talk, spelled that out in any careful way, but yeah, I think sort of the worry about being called anti-enlightenment is that must mean that you're, if you're speaking in France, it's interesting, they think you're speaking for the ancien regime, right? So those are the revolution is still provides their categories. Here, if you're called anti-enlightenment, it means you're anti-science, and therefore you must be a creationist or something like that. So we have these kind of polemical categories circling around the Enlightenment that I think really don't serve us very well at this point, especially given that the forces that are kind of most putting our humanity at risk precisely speak the language of liberation and autonomy. So that's why I think it's imperative to make use of these resources from a more critical strand of philosophical thought that is really kind of been more critical of early modern, philosophy. That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.